Welcome back, everybody. Today is the first of our two talks on Richard Nixon and a bizarre relationship, an even stranger story. The relationship is that of the Quaker Nixon and the German Jewish refugee Henry Kissinger, surely one of the most unlikely combinations to ever grace the White House. The story is one of a duality of simultaneous good and evil, perhaps unparalleled in the history of the presidency. Both the story and the relationship will figure prominently in another dangerous nuclear flashpoint, this one in October '73, which we're going to explore in depth next week. But first today, the dark side, prelude to Watergate. Well, not long ago, I watched a rerun of Oliver Stone's film, Nixon. The entire picture, it seemed, is filmed in the dark. Every sequence, even the victories, were shaded with a foreshadowing of darkness to come. Film shows a tormented soul, a man driven by an addiction to power and intrigue, with a compulsion to live in the arena, a man who seemed to be at his best in defeat, at his worst in victory. There are many dimensions to Nixon. He cannot be lightly dismissed. Whatever the sources of his demons were, they brought freedom closer to the edge in this country than in any other single event in our lifetime, except perhaps McCarthyism, which we discussed in our second session. Now, the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once remarked, "In heaven, all the interesting people are missing." Nixon was no doubt one of those missing persons. And he was certainly interesting, an interesting enigma. His attendance with ex-presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford at the funeral of Anwar Sadat in 1981 prompted this acerbic comment from Robert Dole: "Hear no evil, see no evil, and evil." His presence at a state banquet in the Hall of People in Beijing in 1972 is perhaps the most unlikely scene in the history of 20th century diplomacy. There he stood, the inveterate red baiter Richard M. Nixon, a card-carrying member of the Who Lost China Club, an invective, as we have seen, that plagued Truman, afterward tragically influenced Johnson in Vietnam. And there he was, holding aloft a glass of Mao Tai. Now, for those of you who don't know it, Mao Tai is a Chinese spirit roughly equivalent to lawnmower fuel. And quoting Chairman Mao, "Seize the day, seize the hour." His justification for a U-turn in U.S. foreign policy. Mao, then revered by perhaps 1 billion Chinese as a saint for his great sayings, had incidentally borrowed that particular saying, originally carpe diem, as you know, from the Roman poet Horace. Comedian W.C. Fields once quipped, "I am free of all prejudice. I hate all people equally." Charles Krauthammer characterized Nixon as a man in the W.C. Fields mold. He was, said Krauthammer, a seething cauldron of inchoate hatreds. True enough. But Nixon was also the man who cut through the paranoia of fear, opened the door to China, and he was the man who fashioned détente, ushered in an era of arms control, something other presidents had not been able to do. He's also the man who, after his disgraceful fall from grace in 1974, became the most trusted foreign policy advisor to both Presidents George Herbert Walker Bush and William Jefferson Clinton. On his death in April 1994, exactly 2 decades after he left office, then President Clinton ordered a national day of mourning. All offices were closed. Flags were at half-mast. Clinton delivered a stirring eulogy out in Yorba Linda. Later remarked they hadn't felt that way since he lost his mother. Although Kissinger often referred to the breakthrough as our China policy, was Nixon's initiative from the start. Kissinger deftly executed it. His numerous in-depth conferences with the urbane aesthetic, always cunning Chow En-lai, were vital. But China was a Nixon initiative. Nixon and Kissinger, though close, were insanely jealous of one another. Each feared the other would be credited as the originator of our foreign policy initiatives. Nixon was so obsessed with this that he had his own conversations in the Oval Office taped, not only to leave an historical record, but to prove that his ideas were Nixon's own. The move would contribute, of course, to his eventual undoing. As early as his vice presidency in the 1950s, Nixon had talked of visiting mainland China. By 1966, he had spoken to Leonard Garment, his attorney and a close confidant, about building bridges to Peking, which was then isolated and seemingly in the firm embrace of the Soviet Union. Nixon knew better. Far ahead of his peers in sensing the perilous Sino-Soviet split, one of the significant motivating factors in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in my belief, and a year before his election, Nixon argued for closer relations with China. In fact, he did so publicly in an article published in the October 1967 issue of Foreign Affairs, a renowned quarterly. Given his fierce anti-communist past, his unrelenting prosecution of Alger Hiss, his virulent attacks on Truman, as both soft on communism and as the president who lost China, nobody took Nixon's article very seriously. But in the first year of his presidency, during a trip to Asia under the guise of consulting with our allies in Vietnam, he secretly opened up channels of communication with China through the president of Pakistan, then Yahya Khan. These overtures ultimately paid off handsomely, resulting in our first diplomatic breakthrough to the communist side of the Chinese puzzle since Wilson's scuttle-poor Wellington coup in the province of Shantung in 1919, which we reviewed in our first session. Nixon was undoubtedly one of the brightest of our presidents. He was a skillful tactician. He was one of the most perceptive and innovative minds we have had in the foreign policy arena. This is perhaps why he was so perfect a fit with Henry Kissinger, a brilliant foreign policy tactician in his own right, an admirer of the Realpolitik of Metternich, Castlereagh, Bismarck, and the balance of power tactics of 19th century Europe. The tactics of those subjects, the tactics of those men were the subjects of Kissinger's doctoral dissertation, particularly those of Metternich. And those, particularly of Metternich as well, will figure prominently in Kissinger's ingenious strategy during the Yom Kippur War, which we'll analyze in our final session next week. Both Nixon and Kissinger had studied the lives of great men to serve them as role models. Both believed, as did 19th century leaders depicted in Kissinger's doctoral dissertation, that lofty moral goals had no part in foreign policy. Instead, Realpolitik, a cold-hearted policy based on reality, is what drives a nation's foreign policy. Nations don't have friends, insisted Kissinger, only interests. Now, he's 90 years old. But that tenet defines his foreign policy perspective to this day. You may hear him interviewed on television from time to time, even though he's 90. Bear that in mind. Nations don't have friends, they have interests. Far cry from Wilson's idealistic interventionism, which we visited in our first session. Finally, both Nixon and Kissinger believed that realms of policy making and those of bureaucracy, diametrically opposed, should be split. For that reason, Nixon moved foreign policy decision-making out of Foggy Bottom, out of the State Department, away from the bureaucrats and into the White House. His instrument to accomplish this was to elevate the role of the National Security Council. And in Henry Kissinger, as National Security Advisor, he not only found someone who had read his writings, but who was his intellectual equal. Someone who understood his policies, could carry them out. That's why Kissinger became Nixon's most intimate advisor. But it was Nixon who set the strategic direction, Kissinger who worked out the tactics. Notwithstanding all these deep-seated tensions between this baffling couple, the two of them made perhaps the most influential foreign policy team in American history. Famed author Goethe The tortured character, Dr. Faust, at one point exclaimed, quote, "Alas, two souls are housed within my breast, and each will wrestle for mastery there," end quote. The German-centric Kissinger, undoubtedly with this literary anomaly of Goethe in mind, once remarked, quote, "There's no true Nixon. Several warring personalities struggled for preeminence within the same individual. One was idealistic, thoughtful, generous. The other vindictive, petty, emotional. There was a reflective, philosophic, stoical Nixon," continues Kissinger, "and there was an impetuous, impulsive, and erratic one." Buried in Kissinger's phraseology is a hint of the duality to come in our story of Nixon's inexplicable descent into the abyss of Watergate. The ambivalence which Kissinger perceived is at the heart of our eerily parallel stories. The two paths taken by Nixon are as incongruous as any in the history of the presidency. Both paths had an indelible impact on Nixon's place in history. Both had a profound impact on the psyche of our nation. Ambrose Bierce, in the Devil's Dictionary, defined admiration. Interesting definition. He defined it as the polite recognition of another's resemblance to ourselves. Well, who then did Richard Nixon admire? Turns out we can learn much from the answer. David Gergen analyzed this quite well. Served in the Nixon White House, noted that Nixon admired two role models, and they were indeed, in certain interesting respects, like himself. They were surprisingly Benjamin Disraeli, and not surprisingly, Charles de Gaulle. Disraeli, a conservative prime minister of Great Britain, as you know, during the latter half of the 19th century, often adopted programs and policies of the opposition party, the Whigs, as if they were his own. Ironically, Disraeli, though a conservative, gained a reputation as a founder and advocate of the welfare state. His leadership extended the political base of the Tory party and undoubtedly shaped its traditions for many years to come. Nixon, following this model, brought people such as Pat Moynihan, a lifelong liberal Democrat, into the White House. Although Nixon had campaigned as a conservative, through Moynihan and others, Nixon actually proposed numerous progressive reforms. If you check it out, it's amazing. Some of them passed, some of them did not, but many of them in areas such as the environment, cancer research, workplace safety, and education did. Supported the Clean Air Act. He supported affirmative action. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act. And in February 1974, only a few months before he resigned, he even proposed a health reform package that would have required employers to buy insurance for all of their employees. The Disraeli syndrome, that of the strong conservative leader, being able to take bold steps into areas where less conservative leaders were foreclosed, no doubt, was a major factor enabling Nixon to open relations with China, promote détente, arms control. Tell that to Republicans today, they'll think you've taken leave of your senses. Nixon also idolized Charles de Gaulle. Perhaps no one historical figure exercised a greater hold on Nixon than did the former president of France. Nixon's book, Leaders, published in 1982, he not only devotes an entire admiring chapter to de Gaulle, quotes him time and again in his essay, In the Arena. The admiration was mutual. After Nixon's defeat in the presidential election of 1960, Nixon was a political pariah. He traveled abroad pretty much unnoticed, except in France. De Gaulle, who had risen like a phoenix himself from the ashes numerous times during his mercurial career, foresaw the same possibility someday for Nixon and wisely received him like visiting royalty. De Gaulle, as a role model, impacted Nixon in a number of both positive and negative ways. David Gergen observed that de Gaulle had the same innate ability as did Nixon to leap over the thinking of those who surrounded him and to discern future trends. The 1930s, for example, De Gaulle, then only a lieutenant colonel in the French army, recognized as too few of his contemporaries that the striated battle strategies of trench warfare that had dominated the Franco-Prussian War and the First World War were already rendered obsolete by the development of more mobile implements of war, such as the combustion engine. De Gaulle stood virtually alone in arguing that the Maginot Line was outmoded, would prove virtually useless in protecting France from a German onslaught. De Gaulle's foresight, Gergen contends, instilled in Nixon a belief that a leader must have the prescience that comes from a combination of both intelligence and instinct. Nixon's China initiative derived from both such qualities. Both de Gaulle and Nixon had the same life goals. They wanted to be architects of their times. And the great irony is that they both possessed the innate intellect and instincts to do just that. But the de Gaulle role model was a two-edged sword. There was in the de Gaulle model a fatal flaw. De Gaulle was a patrician. His style of governance was aloof. He was a loner, often acting in isolation. De Gaulle had little interest in mixing with the people. Neither did Nixon. De Gaulle did not care for politicians or the press or almost anyone else for that matter. Neither did Nixon. De Gaulle was imperious. He was haughty. So was Nixon. Robert Dole made this very wry but astute observation about this quality in Nixon. The most extraordinary thing about the Nixon presidency, quipped Dole, was not the way it ended, but that it happened at all. In a business of men who cannot stand to be alone, Richard Nixon wanted men kept away. So in this sense at least, the attempt to emulate de Gaulle only reinforced Nixon's worst instincts. Biographers such as Richard Reeves in his book Richard Nixon Alone in the White House, and people who knew Nixon up close, such as Henry Kissinger, David Gergen, are unanimous as describing Nixon as by nature a loner, a shy man, preferred to work out his grand solutions in his own mind, or at most with the rare partner he felt was a co-equal. In most cases, that was Henry Kissinger. Nixon did not enjoy the hurly-burly of politics, nor was he naturally drawn to the areas of democratic leadership. In fact, argues Gergen, Nixon would often disappear for large parts of the day into a quiet study, away from the hustle-bustle of the Oval Office, to reflect, write, decide on issues. Well, that was his way. Kissinger once observed, no modern president could have been less equipped by nature for political life. H.R. Haldeman called him the mad monk. Well, Nixon was not just a loner. There was a dark side. He was a hater. Like W.C. Fields, however, he was an equal opportunity hater. As the Watergate tapes continue to reveal as more are released, much to the shock and disgust of the body politic, Nixon's comments to his staff about people more often than not were vile, they were repulsive. The bulk of them defy repetition in a public forum. If I read them here, there would be more expletives deleted than expletives. Richard Reeves describes a choice few, which I can read. Nixon called Senator Edward Kennedy a lily-livered mealy-mouth. Tip O'Neill is an all-out dove and a vicious bastard. When the Supreme Court refused to restrain publication of the Pentagon Papers, Nixon lashed out. Supreme Court's a disaster. You got an old fool and Thurgood Marshall, a senile old bastard in black, then you've got Brennan, a jackass Catholic, and then you got Potter Stewart, who's a little dumb, and a weak bastard who's been overwhelmed by the Washington-Georgetown social set. And that's quite mild. Even worse, but much more ironic, were Nixon's anti-Semitic comments. And here lies the greatest irony of all. As more continues to be revealed, his closest confidant and soulmate, to the end of his administration, the man he appointed to the most powerful post in his administration was, of course, Henry Kissinger. Trusted attorney, Leonard Garment. Most influential speechwriter, Bill Safire. Arthur Burns was appointed by him to serve as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Herb Stein to head up his Council of Economic Advisors. His political mentor and the man who steered him through political wars literally from the start of his career in California to his final victory in '72 was Murray Chotiner. And incredibly, the man he turned to for spiritual guidance and solace during his last days in the White House, besides the famous praying incident with Kissinger, was Rabbi Baruch Korf, all Jews. Despite all of these intimate and thoroughly dependent relationships, throughout his administration, as the tapes continue to reveal, Nixon often complained to Bob Haldeman, "Bob, most Jews are disloyal. There are exceptions, but Bob, generally speaking, you can't trust the bastards." Amazing. Other examples of this prejudice in the tapes are legion, including an astonished colloquy with Reverend Billy Graham. Ironically, however, Nixon did not consider himself anti-Semitic. Laughingly, according to Ehrlichman, he once blurted out, "I think Governor John Connally is anti-Semitic. It probably troubles him to deal with Herb Stein, Arthur Burns, Henry Kissinger, Bill Safire, and Leonard Garment. Well, too bad for Connally." Even more to the point, is his more intense, mystifying love-hate relationship with Henry Kissinger. Nixon often used anti-Semitism here as a ploy, cleverly. He was keenly aware of Kissinger's insecurities, complexities, his perpetual fear that he would not fit entirely into Nixon's close-knit coterie of conservative wasps if he was too closely identified with his religion. So from time to time, Nixon would taunt Kissinger by admonishing him. Well, now let's hear the American version, after Kissinger had suggested a course of action which happened to favor Israel, which incidentally happened only rarely. Kissinger was very conflicted and rarely pro-Israel. Nixon developed a great hatred for what he called the Eastern establishment. Following Nixon's 1968 election victory over Hubert Humphrey, the country experienced intensifying anguish over our continued involvement in Vietnam. With no indications whatsoever of the abatement Nixon had promised in his campaign, student protests like those under Lyndon Johnson were mushrooming, prompting marches, strikes on campuses in Washington and other great cities all over America. Of course, there was that famous incident at a Lincoln Memorial at the time of the Kent State Massacre where Nixon ventured out alone late at night with only his aide to the great chagrin of the Secret Service and engaged in colloquy with student protesters. Nixon, rather than reacting by a change of policy, however, actually hardened his stance, mounted a political counterattack against the so-called Eastern establishment. Well, now Kissinger, surely one of those so-called Eastern intellectuals, was keenly aware of Nixon's almost maniacal antipathy to the class. Ironically, often complained, Kissinger did, of these same intellectuals, as we shall see in his damnation of Ellsberg. This phenomenon, as we'll see, ultimately had a devastating effect on Nixon. Vice President Spiro Agnew, at a $100 per plate dinner in Jackson, Mississippi, mouthing a phrase which clearly far above Agnew's pay grade, crafted by the nimble linguist Bill Safire, attacked the so-called liberal intellectuals as nattering nabobs of negativism, snobs, for most of them a disdain to mingle with the masses who work for a living, end quote. This colorful linguistic puppetry from Nixon's failed vice president reflected an aura of hate and disdain that could only have emanated from the very top. The class, the nattering nabobs, the limousine liberals, had rudely excluded Nixon when he graduated from law school. Never forgot shades of Lyndon Johnson and the Pedernales. What else then led to the parallel but antithetical tales of good and evil that are looming here today? Well, firstly, there was a major flaw in Nixon's character we can't ignore. And that is, of course, paranoia. Because of this flaw, Nixon could never really rejoice. Too fearful. Now, let me give you but one poignant example. It happened during the historic breakthrough to China. In October 1970, Nixon had cautiously approached the premier of Pakistan, Yahya Khan, with a request that he act as intermediary in broaching the possibility of a meeting with Chow En-lai. He had heard nothing back. But early in December, out of the blue, Kissinger was called into the office of the Pakistani ambassador in Washington, who said he'd had the following message for the president. At a meeting on November 15th, Chow En-lai had stated, quote, "A special envoy of President Nixon's will be most welcome in Peking." Astounded, elated, Kissinger bolted down the hall to the Oval Office with the news. He and Nixon began crafting an answer that same night to Chow's initiative. Moment of great triumph for Nixon. What he alone had envisioned as early as his 12th day as president, February 1969, was coming to fruition. But now, in Nixon's moment of supreme triumph, bewilderingly, Kissinger reportedly saw no joy in the man who was president. Deep inside, Kissinger thought, Nixon always expected to lose. He always expected his rewards to be snatched away, and always believed his enemies would prevail. His condition for rejection or failure, actually confused by success. It was an insightful observation by a Nixon intimate. Well, many have speculated on the origins of this compulsion, whether it was growing up poor, watching his father, a failed grocer, repeatedly beaten down, watching his two brothers tragically die young, or himself being turned down for a job both by prestigious law firms and by the FBI after working his way through Duke Law School. No one has successfully plumbed the wellsprings of Nixon's paranoia. One thing is for certain, whatever the causes, they ran deep. In the film Catch-22, Alan Arkin once exclaimed, quote, "Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you." Nixon could have uttered that line in earnest. So paranoia, what else? Perhaps as an offshoot of the paranoia, Nixon often made a manageable problem infinitely worse by assuming he had more enemies than he did. For every individual who hated him, there were undoubtedly many others who were merely adversaries. They didn't particularly like him or his politics, but they respected the officer, open to persuasion, if he'd only appeal to their better instincts. But Nixon went to war with them, and swatting at every adversary, real and imagined. His White House multiplied mere scores of enemies into an army. A political crisis was sure to follow. And it was this combination of attitudes, irreconcilable internal conflicts, and enigmatic predispositions in the man Nixon that was the true prelude to Watergate. Well, how then did these dark character flaws become the real prelude to Watergate? Our story of the curious duality begins to unfold on a rare, joyous day in the snake-bit life of Richard Nixon. The date was June 12, 1971. On June 12, 1971, the day of Tricia Nixon's wedding, Richard Nixon has been described as a man who, like any father of the bride, we've all been through it, been shunted aside, left to be nervous on his own, and kept looking out the window. Tricia had wanted an outdoor wedding, and Nixon had agreed. It was to be the first ever outdoor wedding in the White House. It was to be a grand spectacle. But it was raining. The Air Force informed Nixon that there would be 15 minutes of clearing at 4:33 p.m. So at 4:33 p.m. precisely, Nixon escorted his daughter Tricia down the aisle in the Rose Garden, where she became Mrs. Edward Cox at 4:48 p.m. Just as a misty rain began to fall, 59 million Americans watched the ceremony on television. It was a personal triumph and a political coup. At the reception, the president actually danced with his wife, Pat, which had never happened before in public. Many said they'd never seen him happier. But just as Nixon feared, his rewards were to be snatched away. For on the very next day, June 13th, 1971, next to a 2-column picture of the bride and her happy father at the top of the front page of the New York Times, there appeared an ominous 3-column headline that read, "Vietnam Archive, Pentagon study traces 3 decades of U.S. involvement." The Pentagon Papers, as they came to be known, consisted of 7,000 pages of official documents and demonstrated the growing commitment of 4 successive administrations to a non-communist Vietnam. It revealed an ultimate frustration with this effort to a much greater extent than our government had dared to reveal. The ultimate irony is the name Richard Nixon never appears in the Pentagon Papers. Initially, Nixon was not even upset. Nixon told Haldeman initially, well, this is really tough on Kennedy, McNamara, Johnson. Make sure we call them the Kennedy-Johnson Papers. The key is for us to keep out of it. Enter the National Security Advisor. Kissinger had actually been a consultant to the project. It was a Pentagon project that collected the Pentagon Papers. The project director was a former student of his at Harvard, Leslie Gelb, who had been deputy director of the Pentagon Office of Policy Planning during the Johnson administration. Kissinger suspected Gelb of leaking them, but he couldn't have been more wrong. Nixon told Haldeman must have been someone on Kissinger's own staff or just some group of expletive-deleted Jews. It was Kissinger's worst nightmare. We now know, of course, it was Daniel Ellsberg. Kissinger knew Ellsberg. He'd worked briefly for Kissinger in the early days of the Nixon administration, then went on to the Rand Corporation, a Washington think tank. Kissinger had, in fact, once invited Ellsberg to lecture to his Harvard class on Ellsberg's student thesis, The Political Uses of Madness. A fascinating topic, by the way. Ironically, the illusion of the leader's madness was a ploy espoused by Nixon himself as a useful tactic from time to time in the conduct of foreign policy. Ellsberg was a brilliant student who had served as a Marine captain in Vietnam. Apparently, early on, he was a gung-ho patriot. Come back from Vietnam, served as assistant to a CIA operative, a man named General Edward Lansdale, who many feel was a model for dashing and somewhat demented character in the novel The Quiet American by Graham Greene. After working briefly for Kissinger in the Nixon administration, Ellsberg went on to work for the Rand Corporation. But by late 1969, he had turned completely around, become a confirmed anti-war zealot. He and his associate, Anthony Russo, had meticulously copied the papers over a protracted period. Ellsberg, incidentally, is a classmate of mine, and I learned at a Harvard reunion for the first time that his immediate family also helped in the copying, which amazed me. Although Nixon was not initially upset at the leak of the papers, Kissinger was. Kissinger's childhood as a Jew in Nazi Germany had instilled in him a deep mistrust of other people. Not unlike Nixon, he harbored an instinctive distrust of colleagues and insiders alike. But far more important in this instance, because of his ethnic origins, his previous associations with both Gelb and Ellsberg, and the fact that he came out of the very Eastern establishment which Nixon so abhorred, Kissinger felt particularly vulnerable. Aside from this visceral reaction, Kissinger was justifiably fearful that the leak would affect his negotiating power in foreign policy in general and Vietnam in particular. Kissinger advised Nixon, "It shows you're a weakling, Mr. President. Could destroy our ability to conduct foreign policy. If the other powers feel that we cannot control leaks, they will never agree to secret negotiations." When Ellsberg's name came up, Kissinger was savage, claimed he was always a little unbalanced, drugs, sex, shot at peasants in Vietnam. Even H.R. Haldeman was taken aback at Kissinger's vehemence. He thought the National Security Advisor, always unsure about fitting in, was trying to protect himself, trying to divert Nixon from moving toward the conclusion that it had been Kissinger's friends, such as Ellsberg and Gelb, that had plotted to surface the classified documents. Moreover, Kissinger himself had little tolerance for dissenters. He lived with indelible memories of Nazi exploitation, national divisions in order to take power in Germany. During Vietnam, he tried to warn the opposition within the academic community in particular that they might provoke an anti-democratic upsurge from the right. Political analyst Roger Morris noted, Kissinger feared the Weimar thing, in which he and the Jews would be accused of a bug out in Southeast Asia. "We are saving you from the right," Kissinger reportedly told his staff members who resigned over the Cambodian invasion. "You are the right," one of them replied. Kissinger's rage ultimately infected Nixon. It inflamed the set of attitudes and predisposition in the president that we have been discussing. Paranoia, hatreds, the need to obliterate those who disagreed with him, enemies, both real and imagined. Charles Colson told special prosecutors investigating the Watergate scandal, Kissinger got President Nixon so psyched up over the leak, he was near hysteria. For the record, it should be noted, however, that Kissinger never gave any orders for illegal break-ins, nor did he engineer a cover-up of those illegal acts after they occurred. but his effect on Nixon was pivotal. And there was more than a seed of truth in the National Security Advisor's fear that outing classified material could damage his effectiveness. For at this critical time, Kissinger was secretly preparing for a trip to Peking in July, a fact carefully hidden from our own State Department. A leak might have proven fatal to that effort. And at the same critical time, Nixon and Kissinger were meeting with Russian Ambassador Dobrynin, who had traveled here to deliver a proposal for a 5-power nuclear conference. Détente was in the offing. Both were extraordinary foreign policy initiatives that would no doubt have been jeopardized by leaks. So there was a genuine fear. The dialogues with Dobrynin had in fact inevitably turned to the subject of leaks. In order to avoid leaks, Nixon proposed to Dobrynin that he proceed to deal with Kissinger alone on a highly confidential basis, but not with Secretary of State Rogers. With regard to SALT, Berlin, the entire nature of our post-war relationship, it was the beginning of serious movement toward détente. But Ellsberg-type leaks had to be stopped. The critical substructure of Watergate was beginning to take shape, and so our fateful trail of good and evil begins. It all began quite innocently. Nixon ordered Attorney General Mitchell to begin a study of possible criminal liability in the case. Murray Gurfein, a Nixon appointee and then a Southern District judge in New York, had issued a temporary restraining order against the New York Times, halting further publication of the Pentagon Papers. The intention was to allow the government time to consider espionage charges against the source of the classified documents. Notwithstanding the fact that he had triumphed over Humphrey in 1968, Nixon was nonetheless looking for something to prove that President Johnson's halt in the bombing of Vietnam had been just an election ploy to try to stop Nixon from winning that election against Humphrey. Kissinger indicated that he had tried unsuccessfully to locate such documents, but that the Brookings Institute had a file on it. Nixon, frustrated, retorted, "Damn it, get in there and get those files. Blow the safe, get them." Why? Johnson was long gone. Humphrey was long gone. Neither were a threat. The paranoia, the Nixon need to obliterate political opponents, both real and imagined, was certainly a source here, but there was another significant motivation as well, and it goes back to the end of the Johnson presidency. The end of Nixon's successful presidential campaign against Hubert Humphrey coincided with peace talks in Paris aimed at ending the Vietnam War. Johnson knew through illegal wiretaps that candidate Nixon had conspired with Anna Chennault, Claire Chennault's widow, to persuade the South Vietnamese negotiator Bui Diem and Premier Thieu to sabotage the peace talks, informing them that South Vietnam would get a better deal under a Nixon presidency. Chennault succeeded. At the very last moment, Premier Thieu announced that he would stay home. The peace talks, successful outcome of which could very well have swung the election to Humphrey, failed. Nixon won by a thread. Nixon's acts were tantamount to treason. He knew it. Johnson also knew it. But Johnson, although livid, would never reveal the treasonous acts because of the FBI, CIA, and National Security Agency surveillance of Diem, a foreign diplomat, Chennault, a private citizen, and the South Vietnamese embassy that brought him the intelligence. Secrecy was paramount to protect the NSA surveillance and its code-breaking capabilities. Nixon wanted the Brookings files because he wanted any possible bit of intelligence on the subject of his dangerous involvement with Chennault to be destroyed. Now, Kissinger's role in this episode, incidentally, was even more bizarre. Kissinger was attending the Paris peace conferences as an observer reporting back to Johnson's White House, but at the same time, he was leaking vital information as to goings on there to Nixon campaign aide Bryce Harlow. As Nixon aide Richard Allen said some years later, it's a pretty dangerous thing for him to be screwing around with national security. Well, now, Judge Murray Gurfein, ironically a Nixon appointee, vacated the temporary restraining order against the New York Times. Nixon appealed. But the cat's already out of the bag. The public's interest had been piqued, and on June 30th at 2:30 p.m., after expedited appeals, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press by a 6-3 vote. His dark side now overcame Nixon. He'd been rebuked by one of his own appointees, Murray Gurfein. The president exploded, compared Ellsberg to Alger Hiss, told Colson, "We've got a counter government here. Got to fight it. I don't give a damn how it's done. Do whatever has to be done to stop these leaks. I don't want to be told why it can't be done. It's to Ellsberg, try him in the press, leak it out. We want to destroy him in the press. We won the Hiss case in the papers. We did. I had leaked the stuff all over the place because the Justice Department wouldn't prosecute it. It was one of the papers. I leaked out the testimony. I had Hiss convicted before he even got to the jury. Wasn't done waiting for the damn courts, the Attorney General, the FBI. Mr. Brookings? Nixon was so outraged he talked about breaking into the place. They have a lot of material on Johnson's decision to halt bombings. I want Brookings. I want the break-in. Hell, they do that. Break in the place, rifle the files, go bring them in. Just go in and take it. Go in around 8 or 9 o'clock. Next day, still at it. He asked Haldeman, they get Brookings Institute yet? Did they get it raided? Get it done? I want it done. I want the Brookings Institute safe, cleaned out. And so, with the dark demon's ascendant, the dreadful downfall of Richard M. Nixon began, and with it, the nightmare of our nation. So what do the president's men do then to implement his directives? Enter now the demonic duality of Nixon's character that Kissinger had so astutely described, echoing the phraseology of Faust. On July 21, 1971, Ehrlichman reported to the president he created a special investigations unit, which the president had ordered, to handle secret business. Their directives were often to include illegal business that the FBI and the CIA were simply refusing to do without written presidential orders. Ehrlichman set up his close protege, Eagle Bud Crow, and a former Kissinger assistant, 32-year-old New York lawyer David Young, who was enlisted without consulting Kissinger, incidentally. Special Investigations Unit. Their job was to investigate leaks in general and Ellsberg in particular. Well, they set up in a small office in the basement of the White House with a 3-combination safe, sterilized phones, which was very difficult in those days. And they adopted the name the Plumbers, when Young, whose grandfather had been a plumber, put a sign on the door, D. Young Plumber. Their first hire, $26,000 a year, was G. Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent, prosecutor in Dutchess County, New York. Was a wild man, professional killer. Code names, security classifications became an obsession in the Oval Office. So were lie detectors. All were manifestations of the underlying Nixon paranoia. While the president's men were planning burglaries, Nixon and Kissinger were working on reviving a Moscow summit. They secretly broke through to Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who was smarting at having been kept out of the loop by Alexei Kosygin and Andrei Gromyko, men with more experience in foreign policy than Brezhnev. This secret breakthrough was kept not only from Kremlin leaders by Brezhnev, but on our side from Secretary of State William Rogers by Kissinger and Nixon. Ironically, the atmosphere of intrigue pervading the Nixon White House was not unlike that pervading the Kremlin at the very same time. Hunt and Liddy broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Fielding, on September 3 at midnight, Friday night of Labor Day. The operation was paid for by $5,000 in campaign funds provided by Colson on September 2. Leader of the group of burglars was a man named Bernard Baker, Cuban from Miami, who had worked for Hunt when Hunt was a CIA officer. A litany of black bag operations followed. CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, was also moving ahead with so-called black bag operations, advanced spying schemes, dirty tricks designed to disrupt Democratic campaigns. CREEP hired Jack Caulfield, a retired New York detective, and G. Gordon Liddy became counsel of the committee. Caulfield then hired James McCord, a former FBI man, and a CIA agent as a security coordinator. The team was in place. Liddy, in answer to pressure from the president to produce more intelligence on Democratic candidates, set out for Attorney General Mitchell and others a $1 million scheme he called Operation Gemstone to provide intelligence on Democratic candidates and on Lawrence O'Brien, chairman of the Democratic Party Campaign Committee in particular. Note, the administration's authorized black bag operations have already moved from foreign policy leaks to the domestic presidential campaign. Imagine this scene. The flamboyant former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy stood with a pointer in one hand pointing at a display of flip charts. The other hand was bandaged. Why? Because the maniacal Liddy had held it in the flame of a candle to show the pain he could endure in the name of will and loyalty. He now proudly announced to the Attorney General of the United States, I can arrange for the services of highly trained squads, men who have worked successfully as street fighting squads for the CIA, teams that are experienced in surgical relocation activities. In a word, General, they can kidnap a hostile leader with maximum secrecy and a minimum use of force. Liddy was not talking about al-Qaeda, foreign terrorists. He was talking about Democratic candidates. The surreal narrative continued. Lurid descriptions of wiretapping, hiring yachts, hiring call girls, trap unsuspecting Democratic politicians, drugging opponents, using chase planes to tail and intercept messages from airplanes carrying Democratic candidates. Mitchell winked at Dean. The wink convinced Dean that Mitchell knew Operation Gemstone was crazy, the stuff of a John le Carre novel. But remarkably, the chief legal enforcement officer of the United States, Mitchell, didn't discourage it, never shut it down. There was no check, no balance, our Constitution was dead. These then were the president's men in January 1972. 6 months before the Democratic Convention, the group that brought us Watergate was already in place, working with the blessing of the White House. They were beyond the reach of Congress, beyond the reach of the courts, the FBI, the CIA, answerable to no authority except the president, defying all our carefully crafted constitutional safeguards. They had created an atmosphere of mistrust, fear, internal spying, and backstabbing. It was an atmosphere that could only have been induced by a moral paradigm established in the Oval Office itself. The moral paradigm justified by Machiavellian logic. Many were garden variety thugs who could have come right out of central casting. So now the dramatic duality continues. On May 5, 1972, historic and portentous things were taking place. Pulitzer Prizes were being announced, one of the biggest winners being the New York Times for its publication of the Pentagon Papers. Henry Kissinger was secretly meeting with Le Ducteau in Paris, trying to end the Vietnam War, for which he alone, not Nixon, much to Nixon's chagrin, would eventually be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. On that same fateful day, James McCord, security director of CREEP, rented room 419, the Howard Johnson Motor Inn, a room with a view of the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate office building. On Monday, May 22, 1972, the prescient and innovative Richard Nixon, following his Disraeli and de Gaulle role models, became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow. The framework of ABM and SALT, envisioned by Nixon, had been hammered out by Kissinger and his staff brilliantly, with presidential oversight for over more than 2 years. It was an historic first. A joint declaration was signed. On that same day, back in Washington at just past 6 o'clock on Friday evening, Howard Hunt, officially a member of the White House staff, and G. Gordon Liddy, counsel to the finance chairman of CREEP, were hosting a pre-burglary banquet in the Continental Room of the Watergate Hotel. The mind-boggling duality now continues. May 28, 1972, an historic night on which an American president went on Soviet television for the first time in history. On that same night of May 28th, Hunt and Liddy's men finally got inside Democratic headquarters just after midnight, taping open the locks on the doors between the sub-basement garage and the 6th floor. Nixon was at the apex of his career. The coverage has been incredible, Nixon heard from Colson on May 31. You're riding a wave of support that's stronger than anything I've ever seen. And then it got even better. On June 10, George McGovern defeated Hubert Humphrey in the California primary. It was a fatal blow to the Democrats' chances in the 1972 presidential election. Polls show Nixon would defeat McGovern 53% to 34%, unprecedented numbers. Nonetheless, afraid he would again somehow snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in the November election. On June 13th, talking to Colson, the paranoid Nixon said he wanted round-the-clock surveillance of McGovern until the election. On the night of June 14th, after a lobster dinner, Liddy told McCord they had to go back into Larry O'Brien's office since one of the bugs they'd installed earlier wasn't working quite right. This time, McCord volunteered to tape the locks on the doors. Did it wrong, of course, putting the tape on horizontally rather than vertically. A guard noticed this while the burglars were inside. Called the police, discovered McCord and the Cubans in the room. Hunt and Liddy, who were in room 214 of the same hotel, walked out of the hotel and into their cars, leaving behind 32 consecutively numbered new $100 bills. Remember Follow the Money? 2 address books with Howard Hunt's name and White House telephone numbers in them, and a $6.36 check from Hunt to his country club. Police found it all the next day. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, neophyte reporters on the Washington Post, were about to launch careers. Richard Nixon's roller coaster descent into hell was on its way. We all lived through the national nightmare that followed, leaving in its wake the Saturday Night Massacre, fired special prosecutor, resignation of 2 attorneys general, which will figure prominently in next week's story of the Yom Kippur War. The shocking revelations, the cover-ups, the Senate hearings, trials of virtually all the president's men, 25 of whom went to prison, all of whom became household names: Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Colson, Mitchell, Chapin, Segretti, Young, Magruder, Hunt, Liddy, and more, pariahs all. Our nation suffered through this excruciating crisis until Nixon, after having been impeached, mercifully resigned in 1974. The country heaved a collective sigh of relief. Order and calm were finally restored under Jerry Ford, who, whatever else he was thankfully not a seething cauldron of inchoate hatreds. People finally went about their business, no longer stressed that the government was bugging, listening in to their every phone conversation, burglarizing their homes or office, stealing their physicians' files, placing their names on government enemies lists, or secretly marking them for a worse fate. We were indeed closer to the edge of fascism with Nixon than we'd ever realized. Wax philosophical for just a moment. In Federalist 47, James Madison, paraphrasing Montesquieu, wrote the following, quote, "Were the power of judging joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with all the violence of an oppressor." Remember in the now infamous Frost-Nixon interview? Many of you may have seen the movie. Nixon, after several hours of smooth sailing, suddenly ran into bumps, into trouble, and then blurted out, quote, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." And then suddenly there was a break. His second came running in the room, broke it. A slip of the tongue, perhaps, but subliminally he really believed that, for that was the true essence of the man. How prescient then of Madison. Over 180 years later, the dark side of Nixon exposed just that raw nerve in our system. Nixon, bypassing the judiciary, arrogated to himself the power to indiscriminately tape and bug and burglarize first rationalizing that it was necessary in view of national security. Later, having nothing to do with leaks, became a conventional way to bludgeon and bury political opponents. Nixon, at the very pinnacle of his foreign policy success, had transformed himself into that very monster that Madison had feared in 1788. In short, our foreign policy mastermind had morphed into our domestic Leviathan. Presumptuous for any layman to attempt to explain the sources of Nixon's dark side. I'll leave that for the psychiatrist. We can all read Nixon in his own words. Again, in his book Leaders, Nixon revealingly cites this passage from Machiavelli. Let us be clear about one thing, says Machiavelli. Ideals and ethics are important in politics as norms, but they are scarcely effective as techniques. Morals and ethics as norms, but scarcely effective as techniques. These echoes of 19th century Realpolitik may have served him well as a survival mechanism in the foreign policy arena, but the concept was devastating when applied to Nixon's domestic political opponents. So here we have a man, Nixon, a leader possessing innate intelligence, uncanny prescience, and with vision and foresight perhaps unparalleled in the office of president in the foreign policy arena, 20th century. But a man whose demons of hubris, hate, and paranoia brought about a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. His character flaws fashioned an atmosphere in the halls of power in Washington, which endangered our basic freedoms as perhaps no other president in our history. He had become our grand inquisitor right out of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. But what saved us then from a spiraling descent into fascism? Well, the bulwark of the separation of powers established in the Constitution, in this case the impeachment power given to Congress, that was the legal mechanism that forced him to resign the office. But in the end, it was hubris more than anything else that brought Nixon down. A haughty patrician view of man, something his de Gaulle role model unfortunately fit well and buttressed. Remember de Gaulle in a military move backed coup knocked out the Fourth Republic, 1958. When the president does it, that means it's not illegal. The mind of our founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, his mentor, George Mason, a great philosopher, each human being has been endowed by his creator with an inalienable capacity for reflecting and choosing. Unfortunately, Nixon didn't believe that. The minds of these same founders, each human being has an eternal self-determining principle. Nixon didn't believe that. Finally, in the spirit of these same founders, this unique capacity of human nature evokes awe, wonder, respect. It's this quality of awe, wonder, and respect for the individual soul Nixon never had. Just listen to the Watergate tapes. They're available to you now online. You'll perceive in an instant what I'm talking about. In the end, it was this flaw above all that ultimately led to the ruination of perhaps the most perceptive foreign policy mind in the 20th century. It was this fatal flaw that brought to his knees the man who, with the help of his brilliant, ruthless Secretary of State, had untied the great Gordian knot of the China-U.S. impasse and had broken through to détente with the Soviet Union. Where then was all this leading? As we'll see, Watergate had profound effect on the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. The Soviets were well aware of our weakness. Stay tuned as next week we tackle Nixon, paranoia, and paralysis at the nuclear brink. Thank you. Any questions? I know I was talking to a couple of you before. Some of you have actually listened to the tapes, and I know you have a major impression from them. And by the way, there was a gentleman last week who was good enough to give me a rather significant article, brought it up afterwards, about Yahya Khan. Very interesting, fascinating situation. Yahya Khan was a prime minister, but he's a military leader who fashioned a military coup in Pakistan. And there was an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan. And he ruled over East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, and was reputedly responsible for wiping out 300,000 people and sending 10 million into exile into India. However, Nixon knew it, Kissinger knew it, but he was very vital because he had a relationship with Communist China. And he was the intermediary for the breakthrough of Communist China. Nixon was under tremendous pressure from people. Hey, look, this is a human situation going on there in Pakistan. Didn't budge. That's Realpolitik. That's Realpolitik. So I thank you, whoever it was that granted me that. Yes?
Was there any explanation of why Nixon never burned the tapes?
Yeah. The explanation he gave was the following. At the time, Alexander Butterfield revealed them in the middle of the summer. Nixon came down with pneumonia and was in the hospital and fevered. And his explanation to your question was he was very sick. Never make decisions while you're sick. And he had contemplated burning him at that time. He was asked by his aides if they wanted to burn him at that time, and he said no. Regretted it, of course, and after that it became impossible. Subpoenas were out and so forth. So that's the explanation he gave. The only other explanation, of course, is that the reason he taped was he was so extraordinarily interested in history being recorded of the great things that his administration had done, and it had done many great things. He was also very fearful that those things would not be deemed his initiatives. So that was behind it. But that's the explanation he gave, incidentally, that he was ill at the time and made a bad decision while he was in the hospital. That comes from a book, by the way, called Nixon and Kissinger by Dalek, which is an extremely fascinating piece of work on the relationship between both of them. And Dalek tells that story there. Well, next week, we're into the Yom Kippur War in a rather extraordinary situation where Nixon is incapacitated, and we come very close to the nuclear brink. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Enjoyed working with you.
At OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College, enjoy learning simply for the love of it. Educational partners Williams College, BCC, Bard College at Simon's Rock, and MCLA provide some of our outstanding faculty. Take a class in the arts, history, literature, and so much more. Contact OLLI today. Meet new friends. Keep your curiosity alive.